Welcome and thank you for joining us. I want to let you know about some of our upcoming events. On Saturday morning at 10 a.m. on Zoom, we'll be doing program planning. The League is a grassroots organization and issues chosen for study and action originate with the members. So this is the one day a year that we'll be talking about our planning for the next fiscal year, which starts in July. We'd love to have members and non-members alike join us for those important decisions. Also on March 10 at 5:30 p.m., we'll be doing an online event on international women's rights and human rights. We hope you can join us for that. March 16 at 11:30 a.m., we'll have City Council President Sean Elo Rivera and Councilmember Joe LaCava for council concerns discussion. So 3 online events coming up. You can find all the details about those on our website, lwvsandiego.org. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we greatly appreciate the donations that were made today, or were made when people registered for this event. And if anyone would like to donate today, I will put a link in the chat. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Mary Thompson.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you all for joining us today. I am Mary Thompson. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters North County, San Diego, and a member of the Joint Housing Committee. The 2 leagues, San Diego and North County, San Diego, are eager to present today's speakers who are closely involved in the new state laws affecting single-family zoning, Sb9 and 10. Our focus on this topic has many roots. The League supports housing as a basic human need and as a fundamental component of the region's infrastructure. Our positions are all based on the League's process of studying a topic, reaching consensus, and then adopting and advocating on those positions in the public good. We work together to adopt the League's San Diego County Regional Housing Action Policy in 2021, informed by the League's state and national policies and our own grassroots local study. With the passage of SB9 and 10, further study was called for on policies affecting single-family zoning, and that accounts for our focus in today's program. We're excited to hear what our speakers have to say about the opportunities and challenges of implementing new state laws against the backdrop of our new normal housing crisis, some public sentiment to take back local control of these decisions, the debate about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and a way forward as stewards of our region. Our panelists will speak to us until about 12:30. Then we'll have a question and answer period in which Miles Pomeroy, San Diego League Director and Public Policy Chair, and I will moderate. We are delighted to be joined by uniquely qualified speakers. Misa Lennox is from the Office of State Senate President Pro Tem Tony Atkins, author of SB9. Misa's work on the California Assembly's Local Government Committee includes studying proposed bills related to the state's general plan, land use, the housing element, and local agency formation on how laws affect local government. Seth Lichny is the City of San Diego's program manager for community planning and housing, where he oversees the development of housing plans and policies, along with the update to the city's environmental justice element, historic preservation, and amendments to the municipal code. Seth administers the city's 2021-29 housing element goal of 108,000 new housing units. Todd Phillips is the planning manager for the city of Chula Vista, the second fastest growing city in San Diego County. Todd directs the city's planning division within the city's Development Services Department to manage performance against the latest housing element goal of nearly 11,000 new housing units. David DeVries is city planner with the City of Poway, where he manages planning, building, code enforcement divisions for the city's Developmental Services Department. Poway is known as the city in the country, with over half of the city's 39 square mile area preserved as dedicated open space. Poway's 2021 to 29 housing element goal is approximately 1,600 new housing units. We are anxious to hear what they have to say, so let's start with Misa.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that introduction and for having me today. Here, like you mentioned, on behalf of the pro tem, she sends her apologies that she couldn't be here herself, but appreciate the opportunity to come in her place. So thank you again to you and everyone at the League of Women Voters. So I've been asked to talk today about SB9 and 10. Both bills were a part of the Senate housing package. Building opportunities for all. This housing package contained about 11 bills, all with sort of the collective goal of housing production. The development of this housing package actually contained a lot of bills that were reintroductions, meaning they were part of a multi-year process in the legislature. So I thought it might be sort of helpful just to kind of begin our conversation here today by setting the stage as to sort of what that conversation looked like during that time for us in the legislature. So this was following the failure of SB50. That might be a bill that some folks remember. It was all over, kind of the news at the time. This was in January of 2020, and the pro tem pulled together a Senate housing lead group. And this was a group that was comprised of senators that were from geographically diverse areas. And they also shared really differing opinions on SB50 housing policies about, production and those issues in general. So SB 1120, which was the predecessor to SB9, these bills were the product of this Senate housing lead group. All of the amendments, meaning all the changes that were made to the bill throughout the course of this kind of 2-year process, were all discussed among the group to ensure consensus. And the goals of SB9 really broadly were, how can we get at this housing crisis in the state? We know California has underproduced housing since the 80s. And the pro tem has also been very intentional about not touting this bill as a silver bullet to the housing crisis. We know that this is one tool in the toolbox. We know that it's taken decades to get where we are. And this one bill is not going to solve that, right? So hopefully this bill, in addition to others also included in the Senate housing package that we'll talk about today, in addition to some really important investments that the legislature and the governor made in the budget last year, right? $12 billion towards homelessness, $3 billion towards affordable housing, and those continues to be priorities as we talk about this year's budget, can hopefully, help us take steps towards getting at the housing crisis. So back to SB9, it was, signed into law by the governor on September 16th in 2021. It became effective as of January 1st this year. And the bill really provides options for homeowners by streamlining the process for them to create a duplex or to subdivide an existing lot in single family zones up to 4 units. Because this was sort of such a contentious point while the bill was moving through the process, I'll underscore that point again. SB9, it allows no more than 4 units on what is currently a single family parcel. And just a reminder to folks that prior to SB9, right, under existing law, single family parcels could already have 3 units because of ADU law, right? So you could already have a single family home, an ADU, and a JADU. So while this bill does apply statewide, the parcel has to be located in a jurisdiction that's part of an urbanized area or an urban cluster. And that's a designation that's done by the US Census. And what this really means is that it applies only to areas that meet certain population and density thresholds. And then in order to protect, existing tenants, historic districts, environmental quality, coastal requirements, SB9 really established kind of a list of specific qualifications that have to be met in order for homeowners to utilize the bill. So for example, historic and landmark districts, those are excluded. SB9 doesn't supersede the Coastal Act. SB9 units can't be used as short-term rentals. And then another sort of point I think that's important to underscore, because was a lot of conversation about this as the bill was moving through the process. And then there continues to be, as we're sort of seeing in the implementation phase here today, which is how to protect neighborhoods from speculation and gentrification. And that is something that I would like to focus on for a minute here, just to explain some of the safeguards that are in the bill and in the law today. So SB9 really limited individuals from receiving ministerial lot splits on adjacent parcels. And this was really to prevent institutional investors from changing the look and feel of whole neighborhoods, right? It specifically prevents profiteers from evicting or displacing tenants because it excludes properties where any tenant has resided in the past 3 years. The bill also requires a homeowner to occupy a property for at least 3 years following a lot split. So those I think are kind of important things to remember throughout our discussion today. And I know you'll also hear in greater detail from some of the local government folks here to talk to you today about some of the issues that they're contending with. So I won't go into too much detail just on the local control front, but just to broadly mention that under SB9, local governments can impose objective zoning, subdivision, and design standards as long as they do not conflict with the bill and as long as they don't physically preclude a lot split or a duplex of at least 800 square feet from being built. So to that end, right, a homeowner still has to comply with local zoning requirements, whether that's height, floor area ratios, lot coverage when they're developing their duplex or lot split under the bill. And in the past few months, you've probably seen some media coverage regarding some local decisions that have received a bunch of attention. One in particular for, attempting to avoid compliance by declaring like their entire city a mountain lion sanctuary. And I think this is important to mention just because we saw pretty swift action from the Attorney General. He clearly has an important role to play on matters regarding compliance with the law, right? Our office is also in pretty close contact with the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD as we refer to them. The bill didn't specifically call out HCD to develop guidance or anything of that sort, but obviously SB9 doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? A lot of issues that, housing issues that are really important and that this bill sort of fits into a puzzle with, they obviously have a large role, whether it's housing elements or inclusionary requirements, they have a role to play. So our office will continue, to stay in we'll continue to stay in close contact with them, as we continue to move through the process. So SB9 really seeks to create more inclusive neighborhoods. The homeownership opportunities in the bill are a really important aspect to the pro tem. Her own personal experience, really growing up in a working family with parents that were never able to own a home, and the importance of just providing more working families with the opportunity to establish multi-generational wealth. Really broadly, the goals of the bill are to allow for more types of housing to create more equitable and inclusive neighborhoods. And that really sums up sort of the basics of SB9. So before we talk briefly about SB10, the pro tem didn't author this bill, but it was part of the housing package that I mentioned. It was first introduced as SB 902, and then the next year as SB 10. It was signed into law the same day as SB 9. So SB 10 provides cities with a tool to provide for more residential density near public transportation and in existing urbanized areas. Specifically, it allows localities, if they choose to rezone, for up to a 10-unit building in a streamlined way. And the ordinance obviously is exempt from the CEQA process. This is similar to something that was done with ADU law. The bill excludes parcels in really high fire severity zones and publicly owned land that's been restricted or designated as open space or park and rec space. And the authority for a locality to adopt an ordinance sunsets Jan 1 in 2029. So I apologize for my voice there, but that basically sums up those two bills. Looking forward to the discussion today and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mesa. Let's give your voice a rest. We'd like to hear from next from Seth Lichny. I will comment, he's got the lion's share of the new housing units that need to be built under the new housing element. So Seth, let's hear from you.
We've definitely planned for it, Mary, and we want to see it all get built, and we're working toward it here. I'm going to share my screen with a presentation that I put together that I think can help provide some visuals. As long as it goes to full screen, that would be great. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just real quickly, again, my name is Seth Lichny. I'm program manager for the City of San Diego Planning Department, and happy to be here today. I think I spoke to this group a few years ago, possibly, about some of the housing work that we were doing at Sandag. I'm glad to follow up with some of the work that's being done at the City of San Diego. And so we wanted to talk a little bit today about some of the SB9 implementation local challenges. And I think the City of San Diego is in and my counterparts with the other cities in the region are all in different places when it comes to implementation. And so we did have City Council approval of our Sb9 Implementation Proposal on February 8th, so just a few weeks ago. So I think we're in a position to talk about some of the things that were challenging with getting that, moving that forward, but also looking forward to what's coming up next. So let me see here. Okay, there we go. So Sb9, what we were tasked with doing, and the city of San Diego fully supported the concepts and the ideas that Misa just laid out about how Sb9 can be important for developing more housing in the city of San Diego. Fully embracing the idea of opening up new areas for more housing development to help meet the needs of San Diego residents and help solve our housing crisis. The bill was actually approved right at a time that we were in discussions about potential amendments for the city's accessory dwelling unit ordinance, which has been adopted over the last several years, has had a couple of years to become implemented, and provided us with some potential areas where we wanted to make sure that Sb9 could avoid the kind of issues that we had seen rise up from our ADU program. And so what we were tasked with doing was implementing it in our land development code with some customized provisions. And those provisions are specific to our city and specific to addressing certain issues. So for example, tree canopy, we heard from residents that places that were developing ADUs weren't required to replace any of the existing trees in these neighborhoods. And we certainly believe that trees play a role in the fabric of a community. They play an important role in addressing climate change. And we don't necessarily want to see our urban tree canopy reduced with the addition of these new housing units. We wanted to look at development impact fees and ways that we can incentivize the type of development that can occur under Sb9, while also providing the needed public amenities for our residents. Parking requirements and setbacks are a couple of other things that we've heard from residents through our ADU program that can be an issue, whether it's this kind of new experience of having a neighbor with a two-story building that is now can see into a neighbor's yard. We wanted to make sure that we had some requirements in place that could help maintain some of the privacy that folks are used to. So the challenges with the Sb9, I think it starts with how it interacts with our ADU program. And Misa did a nice job of outlining the requirements of Sb9, so I won't go over those again. But they don't line up perfectly. They line up very close, but not perfectly with the ADU program that the city's adopted. And so what we had to do from the start was take a look at both at our existing program and what we had to do with Sb9, and really try to find a way that these two programs could work in tandem. We think that they both share similar goals of increasing housing. And we really want to have, we don't want to necessarily see our ADU program get overtaken by Sb9 and vice versa. And so what we had to do as we were looking at the requirements, and the way that we set this up was to try to find a balance between the two. And so we wanted to, so we also included some ADU amendments as part of our Sb9 implementation, so that there was better alignment between the two. Now, there's some places where it just doesn't line up. The ADU program, the ADU state law says that we cannot charge certain development fees for ADUs that are under 750 square feet. And it doesn't have that similar requirement for Sb9. So we needed to figure out a way that we could say, we want to make sure that we're having collecting the fees that we need, but also incentivizing development. And again, making sure that we're not kind of leaning one way or the other. And then there's other complications with Sb9 as it relates to lot splits that aren't necessarily with ADU programs. There's affordability requirements for ADUs in state law that aren't necessarily included in Sb9. And so we were really looking for a way to create some balance. And I think this picture kind of shows what we were really trying to do, is connect the two programs, make them work in tandem and work together, so that the property owner can say, what is the best approach for me to add some additional housing units? Is it ADUs or is it Sb9? And there will be different situations where both will work, But what we didn't want to do was make it lean one way or the other toward a specific program. Another challenge, and Misa touched on this, was the geographic limitations. SB9 does not necessarily apply to every single family home in the region. There are a number of places where it doesn't apply: historic areas, flood zones, agricultural areas, areas of fire hazard, all the things that were listed off and included in the bill. The difficulty with this at a local level is really kind of nailing down the impact of that on your areas that are zoned for single families. For example, some of the flood zone areas don't necessarily follow a property line. And so what happens when it's bisected, where some of the property is in the flood zone and some of it isn't? There's allowances for certain mitigation measures that a property owner could take to still, even if they're within one of these areas, to still apply. And that becomes a real challenge because you will have folks coming in that want to get moving on this program. And we need to be very certain about whether or not we're complying with the state law about where it's allowed and where it's not. So we're still working through that issue, but I think it's certainly still one of the ongoing challenges. Another challenge to local implementation, I have up here our actual schedule for what we got adopted, and it was very aggressive, and it really needed to be. I think the important date here is January 1st in 2022, which is when SB9 became effective. It became state law. The components that are in the law are allowed today, no matter what the city of San Diego had done. And so we very quickly, after SB9 was adopted, were able to turn around and get a proposal in less than 2 months in front of our Community Planners Committee. And then the next 2 days later in front of our Planning Commission before we got approval from the City of San Diego Committee and full City Council itself earlier this month. The proposal will actually take effect 30 days after the signing of the resolution, which will land sometime in March or April of this year. And so one of the big issues here that I'll highlight is this time between when SB9 became effective and when the city's requirements become effective, and that just creates uncertainty. We have local requirements that we want to see get included as part of this. Again, we're trying to create that balance between SB9 and ADUs. We want to see the program improve neighborhoods. We want to see more housing and more availability for folks to live in neighborhoods throughout the city. But it's just very difficult to do without making those kind of local decisions and having the backing of the city council to say, yeah, this is the approach that we want to take. And so having this level of uncertainty and going through such a quick process and such a quick turnaround to get it done is not ideal, I would say. We're working through it and we're getting things done. This is just a challenge that comes with being a local government in the state of California. So solutions, and I'm sure this is something the state hears all the time, probably nothing new to MISA, but we could use more time when implementing these things. What you didn't necessarily see on that timeline on my previous slide was a real engaged public output, public outreach, really trying to get feedback. We needed to get something on the books so that we could implement SB9 and get it moving as soon as possible. And so, appreciate the urgency of the state of California, but when they adopt something in September and it takes effect on January 1st, that's very difficult. And then also state guidance, and Misa's touched on that already. I think you probably would hear different interpretations of SB9 and how it will apply locally from just about any planner or public official that you talk to, and state guidance can help clear that up. But I understand it takes time to make it happen, which is why more time might be a potential solution to make these kind of decisions a little bit easier. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to show real quickly a cool little graphic that we put up as part of our presentation that can show an SB9 scenario development under our new requirements. In this instance, you've got a 5,000 square foot lot here where the single family home is replaced by the development of two-story duplexes. Under our new proposal, we would require 4-foot setbacks because these two-story buildings are adjacent to other residential uses. We would require the development impact fee be paid on the second duplex only as part of our incentives for the development impact fee. We waive it for the development of the first 2 units under SB9. A third and a fourth unit would then have to pay. We would require tree canopy to ensure that we still have tree coverage in this area. So 1 tree per lot, and the city's street tree ordinance would apply. And the parking requirements would be one parking space required for each of these duplexes if it's outside of an area that's got access to transit, known as a transit priority area. So we think that we've got some good public benefits here so that we can ensure that the development that we see in the city of San Diego benefits neighborhoods, benefits all of our residents, and provides more options for housing. So what's next? Misa already talked about it. SB 10, 10 units in all zones in transit-rich and urban infill sites. Particular set of challenges coming forward with that, and we're just getting this off the ground. The Mayor Gloria announced at his State of the City address that the city will be moving forward with SB 10. So it's certainly front and center on my radar screen. But some of the challenges we're already seeing is defining the geographic area of where this applies. There's a requirement that SB 10 include a fair housing component. And so that suggests that maybe the areas where SB 10 most applies aren't the same throughout the entire city. Do we want to have some of these localized customized provisions so that we can ensure that we're improving neighborhoods as well as building housing? And then again, getting back to what's the interaction with SB9 and ADUs, we'll have to revisit that whole question for SB 10. So be on the lookout. We'll have, this will be part of our next housing proposal. We do expect to have it out here in the next couple of months. One thing you don't see on the challenges for SB 10 is time, because it's an opt-in program for local governments. So we do expect to have a proposal put forward with a number of opportunities for public outreach and engagement as well. So definitely looking forward to that next step in our process with the city of San Diego. So that wraps things up for me. Thank you so much for having me today. I look forward to answering questions.
Well, thank you, Seth. It's so great to hear the problems you're facing, to get that deeper appreciation. Next, we're going to hear from Todd Phillips, who is speaking to us from Chula Vista, the second fastest growing city in San Diego County. So that has its own problems. So let's hear it, Todd.
Thank you so much, Mary. I appreciate it. I want to thank the League for having us here to talk about our own specific challenges. I'd like to just say everything that Seth said and then some. He covered it very well. I don't want to belabor any of the issues that he's already covered. I'll just try to get a little bit of a flavor from the Chula Vista perspective and some of the challenges that we're facing. For many, you know that Chula Vista is the kind of the tale of two cities. We have the western side, which is far older and more urbanized. And then we have the eastern side of our city that is master planned, much newer, has its own set of challenges that we grapple with. And so as we started to tackle SB9, we really started to look, okay, well, what zones, you know, are impacted through this? And so we looked at our single family residential zones. And so right now the majority of SB9 will impact the western side initially. But as we start to transition some of our specific plans in those master plan communities out on the east side, as we start to transition them into and be governed by our general plan and municipal code and out from under their specific sectional area plan planning documents, more and more of the city will start to become impacted by SB9. So some of the challenges we faced, obviously, the feedback from the residents of Chula Vista. There is definitely a segment of the of residents who are excited about this and the opportunities that this is going to present for them in terms of home ownership opportunities. But we also have a lot of negative feedback, you know, from people who are afraid that their neighborhood character is going to be destroyed through this. And what we've tried to do is do some of that education and outreach to say, you know, the ADU ordinance is providing opportunities, and this is just going to be another tool in that toolbox, and it's going to follow that framework very well. Obviously, some of the things that we are worried about are obviously the impacts to infrastructure from parks, fire, police, schools. You know, as we start to go down the road of implementation, we're going to be, you know, questioned by our planning commission and our city council as to, well, where can this, you know, show us a map of where this can, you know, occur. And we have communities that never intended necessarily, when it was first planned, to have this much intensity of use in it. So it's just a challenge that we have to think about as we start to implement this, and as the city grows, and as the city starts to accommodate these kinds of units. I know that our Mary mentioned our RENA number is just a little over 11,000. This is the majority of our numbers are going to probably be met on the west side. We have the capacity to do it, so it's not an issue of capacity in terms of the ability of the city to accommodate these. It's more, how do we do this in a measured way and thoughtfully, and how do we develop the tools that we need to give to the community, so they are educated about what their opportunities are on their properties. So we are still in that phase. Seth had it stated it very well in his presentation. There's that uncertainty phase that we are in. We are planning to go in front of the Planning Commission on March 9th with our draft ordinance. And if everything goes right, we will go in front of the City Council by the end of March. I think of this 22nd is what we're looking for, with an implementation of early April. But we are still getting the inquiries now. You know, folks are coming in and saying, I'd like to split my lot. How do I do that? And so how do we accommodate that? So what Seth said is, you know, time is of the essence. It's definitely working against us in terms of trying to get everything up to speed internally, and all the processes and all of our documentation reflecting the new requirements. It's been a challenge, but we're moving forward on that. Another challenge that we've had is, and I think everybody can appreciate this, sometimes the legislative language that comes down from Sacramento is not the clearest. And there can be a number of different interpretations of how something is written. So that's always a challenge for us. And then we would love to, you know, I think something that we've always said is, you know, when things like this come down from Sacramento, having like a shell ordinance would be, you know, fantastic. Again, something that we can look at and say, okay, that, because sometimes the intent is lost in some of that language, but a shell ordinance kind of, you know, okay, I see how, you know, what they're driving at. Because again, even around our own table, as we talked about, how are we going to do this? We had differing interpretations of some of the provisions. So, you know, for example, I use this as one of those examples. The language of SB9 talks about that the city cannot preclude the development of a unit to be less than 800 square feet. But that doesn't preclude a developer or not a developer, but an owner from building smaller than that if they want to, if they so choose. But there were some people around the table that were like, no, we have to have it minimum 800 square feet. I think some cities are even looking at, I think maybe Coronado, please don't quote me, but I think maybe Coronado even wrote it into their ordinance that it must be 800 square feet minimum. But we're not taking that tack. We're definitely allowing, you know, if they want to go smaller, they can go smaller. But, you know, with respect to, as Seth said, development impact fees, you know, we can charge them on the SB9 units, but ADUs are exempt from them at that size. So there are a lot of things, a lot of moving parts to this. And I think at the end of the day, some of this will come down to, or at least we are thinking that we will get into an issue of semantics on some of this, as to if someone has developed an ADU and now wants to consider that as a second unit that they want to now partition off and sell. Well, we didn't charge it diff fees, and now we do, and how do we recapture that? And so it's going to create challenges as some of those ADUs come in to maybe be considered as a 2-unit development that is now going to be partitioned off through the lot split. So again, there's just a lot that was packed into this bill. I think at the end of the day, Chula Vista is definitely on the side of wanting to create more opportunity, and we have the capacity to do so. So it's not an issue of political ideology or anything like that with respect to providing those opportunities. It's just how do we do it in the most measured way and make sense for our residents, as well as with our processes and our ordinances and for our council. So it's really going to come down to education. That's obviously a big component of this. I deal with questions on a daily matter. Right now, I think I'm the subject matter expert within the city on SB9. So they all get funneled to me, and it is a constant education component of, well, what does your property have? What does it look like? Well, let's look at it. Maybe ADU is better for you. Maybe SB9 will be a good option for you. So it's a constant struggle. And of course, we're not in the development business. We are there just to give information and of course to process these things. So it's a fine line of educating the public about what their opportunities may be under these two different laws, without stepping over into, well, you should do this and this. If you did this, well, then you could do that. So it does create problems for us in that respect, but we're excited about it. We still have a lot of work to do. As I said, this next month is going to be a busy one for us to try and get this through and get the ordinance adopted. But we're excited about it, and I'm excited to hear some of the questions that we might get today. Sorry I didn't have a PowerPoint. Seth definitely takes the gold star for that, but I think you're going to hear some of the same comments from David as we go through today and answer some of the questions that come up.
Thank you, Todd. It is so great. I'm sorry to hear about the problems, but it's so great to get a deeper appreciation of these problems of two laws coming together and cities needing to implement. So David, you've got the distinction of the city in the county, city in the country rather, with so much square acreage in open space. So what are your particular problems?
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to everyone for allowing me to discuss Poway and our current position on SB9 and SB10. So I'll do a little background on Poway and some of the things I know about what's happening with safety elements and wildfire prevention at the state level and also at the local level. So Poway has a smaller population of 50,000 residents, but covers a large 40 square mile area. As was stated before, half of the city's area mass is preserved as dedicated open space, and we have over 76 miles of trails. A lot of fun if you haven't been out here before hiking the trails. There's some real popular ones and then a lot of remote ones too that are really great to hike on. Our habitat conservation plan requires that 80% of these areas be protected as open space. And approximately 75% of the city is actually in the very high fire hazard severity zone. So a lot of wildfire prevention is needed. And wildfire is a significant hazard in the Poway area, with major fires impacting residents in 2003 and 2007. There are also residential areas in the floodway and the floodplain subject to flood risk. So many of these hazard risk areas do not have adequate defensible space, home hardening, fire access, evacuation routes, fire suppression systems, water utility access, and other essential emergency service needs. So contrary to SB9 and ADU laws, the state is largely discouraging housing in very high fire hazard areas. And bills like SB 1241 require that city safety elements address the risk of fire in very high fire hazard areas. Appendix G of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, was updated in 2018 to require an analysis of wildfire impacts for projects located in very high fire hazard areas. And then my understanding from recent articles is that many city residential projects in California are encumbered with lawsuits now because fire risk was not properly analyzed as a part of the environmental review process. So taking all this into account, our fire chief made a finding that additional units above established densities presents additional wildfire risk and service impacts, and additional units should not be permitted until we appropriately analyze the mitigation that needs to be in place. So given the position of our fire chief and evolving interpretations with SB9, as Todd touched on, the city decided to release a handout based on the city attorney's interpretation of SB9 at that time. And so our plan is to take a draft ordinance to the city council once some of the dust is settled related to lawsuits and HCD's guidance documents, which have yet to be released. I'm hearing that might be further delayed for a few months. So hopefully they have some guidance coming to the local jurisdictions. And so as such, I'm going to share our current handout. And as such, our current handout shows that SB9 developments and lot splits are prohibited in the city's very high fire hazard areas, habitat conservation areas, and these flood hazard areas. The city also prohibits SB9 developments and lot splits in Proposition FF areas. These Proposition FF areas are largely rural residential areas that require voter approval for increased densities, and these areas overlap with high fire hazard areas. I do want to preface all of this that once we go to city council, the city council may want to seek ways to allow these types of developments in these hazard areas, and then obviously we do some enhanced or increased actions related to mitigation that's needed. I also want to state that the city is definitely not opposed to density. It just wants to ensure that these new housing units are safe and any hazard risks are properly mitigated. For instance, in the Poway Road corridor, the council has approved densities over 35 dwelling units per acre. And if you haven't been down Poway Road lately, you'll now see a lot of newly created 3-story residential buildings with a lot more to come. So it's something that the city council is definitely an advocate of housing and affordable housing. So for SB9 developments, without a lot split, the city's interpretation is that up to 2 dwelling units may be permissible after 2 main single-family residences on a single lot are established. And let me scroll down here. So this section here is the section I was referring to about the exclusions on the property, and you can find this with an easy Google search, and I'm told this will also the link will also be added to the chat here. I'm going to scroll down. So we developed these figures after seeing some great examples that the city of Santa Barbara did, and so this first figure 1 shows an SB9 development without a lot split and the different configurations that our interpretation is seeing possible. And keep in mind, these aren't all the configurations. So you could do 2 single-family residences attached, and then you could also do detached with an attached ADU, or you could do 2 single-family residences with 2 detached ADUs. Then for the urban lot split, you'll see in figure 2, there's a maximum of 2 units allowed per lot. And so you can see some of the different configurations that we're showing possible here. This is one on the right is probably the one that maximizes the density the most, with 2 single-family residences and then a single-family residence and an ADU. This ADU could also be replaced with a single-family residence based on our interpretation of the law. So as Misa touched on, we're not seeing any way to permit more than 4 units on a pre-existing single-family residential lot. I have heard discussions and debates about that. So I think that's still something that is under discussion as far as the maximum number of units based on the letter of law. And the figures, just reiterating that these configurations in figure 2 also don't show all the potential configurations. So there are other possibilities. So the handout does comply with the SB9 objective standard requirements. One of the things that we struggled with was the access regulations. SB9 stipulates no street improvements can be required, but then there's still the parking requirement, and a curb cut is needed for parking. And we also have a requirement that each lot has a minimum 20-foot vehicular access. So in some instances, we will be requiring a new curb cut for parking on one of the new SB9 lot splits. I did see in the chat some concern about enforcement. So we will have a requirement that the property owner sign a covenant to capture the owner occupancy requirement, and that the future development, any future development on the property is in conformance with SB9 requirements. That way, if it transfers ownership, the new property owner would understand that there's some limitations as far as future development on the property, because it is under the SB9 requirements. Generally speaking, I do think this is going to be difficult to enforce. Oftentimes you'll see some property owners sign these covenants, not move into a property and lease it out. And unless a neighbor or a tenant complains, we're really not going to know if they're in compliance or not. And even if we do get a complaint, that compliance process is usually several months. So just to give everyone a heads up on that. I did take a look at Zillow. I was kind of curious about housing trends and such as it relates to ADU and SB9 that was effective earlier this year. So you'll see on the graph here, the orange line. This is California as it relates to housing prices from 2017 to 2022, and then this is for the United States in general, the line in green here. And so, this opinion is my personal opinion, both as a planner and a licensed real estate broker. So please note, this is not the opinion of the city of Poway's, but, there is this increasing of density on these single family residential lots increases demand from investors. So this is definitely something, SB9, that is enticing to investors. And you'll see with ADU laws, even corporations are now increasingly investing in California's single family residential market, competing with traditional home buyers and driving up housing prices. So, when you look at a construction loan to do a, adding an addition, a unit, doing a lot split, most lenders will require at least 30 to 40% down as a part of that process. And for most traditional homeowners, this is not something that they have on hand. So, some down payment assistance programs are definitely needed for these types of developments and generally home buyers in general. But I think what we'll see is these SB9 units are still going to be largely built by investors and corporations who want to maximize their rent. Maybe they don't even rent it out for 3 years and take advantage of the fact that they can add these units thereafter. So just to summarize this in short, my research is saying that the ADU bills and SB9 bills will continue to drive up housing prices and especially rents. So you'll notice trends when these investors take over. They obviously want to maximize the profits. And so they take over, add units, and then and then they maximize rents. Usually they're willing to work with existing tenants. I know the state's done a good job of limiting rent increases and things like that. So I think programs like that are successful, and investors are generally willing to work with good tenants, but over time, obviously rents will be maximized. So this graph is showing that since the last ADU bill was effective in January 2020, there was actually a housing price increase in California of over 33% to 2022, which is interesting because California actually had a decrease in population during that same time frame. So I think it's, if anything, just something to be considered as a part of the conversation when we're talking about housing legislation and housing law, that there is investors and corporations who also are looking to take advantage of these housing programs. And then as it relates to, I'll go ahead and stop sharing here. And then as it relates to SB10, the city will not be utilizing SB10 at this time. As we discussed previously, the large majority of the city is in a very high fire hazard area, and there are no transit-rich areas in the city. So this concludes my discussion points on SB9 and SB10, and I'd be happy to answer any additional questions. Thanks again for having me.
Well, thank you, David. You've been reading the minds of our audience because we have a lot of questions. I'll try and summarize the first question, and then I'll hand it over to Miles for, we'll alternate in our questioning. But the first question, it surrounds affordability. If the goal of this is affordable housing, there are a lot of concerns about exactly how does this address that, given some of the concerns you voiced about investors and that impulse. So whoever wants to start in responding to that, there's a lot of questions about this.
I'm happy to start, Mary, and fingers crossed, forgive my coughing fit earlier, so thanks. Yeah, so I think just I'm happy to kind of put in the chat too, just sort of a little bit of a different perspective, I think, than the one David shared. We heard a lot of concerns while ADU laws were, bills were going through the process in the legislature, general concerns about institutional investors and increasing land value and things like that. There's a good study that one of the analyses points to that talks basically about how state corporations own about 17% of California's housing stock, and only 8% of the ADUs in the state have actually built on their property, and talks a little bit about how their business model is really predicated on raising rents, not increasing the stock of new housing. So just to share a little bit of a different perspective, I think that might be helpful. And I'm happy to sort of link to the chat where you can find all of the committee analyses that are done. And then as to sort of the broader question about affordability, obviously it was one that came up time and time again while the bill was moving through the process in the legislature. I think a lot of different ways to answer it, but I would just sort of remind folks too of kind of the situation that we're talking about, right? I think, David and Todd and Seth did a great job of laying out a number of potential scenarios that are allowed under SB9. Some of them are extremely gentle density, in which case we'd be talking potentially about one new unit, right? In an instance where like someone takes advantage of the duplex provision, for example. So I think for the state to try to sort of impose broad affordability requirements across the state throughout all of these different scenarios that may be possible under the bill is a difficult thing. We're seeing in a number of localities that conversation is going on locally. Like Seth mentioned, sort of that conversation as it pertains to ADU law. Other cities we know are looking at various inclusionary requirements and things like that. So, and again, I think, right, going back to sort of the concept that this bill is not going to solve all problems, right? Affordable housing is an extremely important aspect. But again, I just, remind folks the situation we're talking about here is gentle density and the addition of possibly like one more unit, right?
Yeah, and I'll just tag on to that, Mary, if you don't mind. I think the very specific language that's included in ADU law that says that we need to incentivize affordable units that was absent in SB9 was something that we had to consider locally when we were implementing SB9. And we even saw stories and heard occasions where cities were adding affordability requirements to SB9 to discourage its use. And so I think we took a similar approach to what Misa is describing. This is a tool in the toolbox to help open up areas for more housing development. It may not necessarily be deed restricted affordable housing at this point, but it is an opportunity to develop more housing. And in addition, the proposal that we brought forward to the City Council was what we call a housing action package that included a number of other local measures to incentivize affordable housing development in places with access to transit, so that we're still moving forward on meeting our climate goals. So we look at this as just another way to provide more housing in the city of San Diego, but we're also looking for other ways to encourage and incentivize more affordable housing development as well.
Any other thoughts about the affordability question? We'll move on to another question.
Mary, I can just state that, or I'd like to state that, you know, the regional housing needs allocation that's passed down to this by the state, I think is an amazing program and does a great job of ensuring that the housing needs across the whole state level are met, you know, and each city gets their own allocation of housing needs, and included in that are programs that these units be affordable at certain income levels and such, and a certain number of units have to be affordable to those income levels and things like that. So, you know, I think that program's very successful. I'd really like to see the state start going in a direction where there's more housing assistance, you know, financially for low-income home buyers and renters, and especially with the construction, you know, getting more down payment assistance for you know, mom and pop homeowners to actually do some of this construction that ADU laws and SB9's you know, advocating for. So, you know, just a couple final thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's actually a great point. Just to point out like a couple of stats from last year's budget. The included in the budget was $100 million for Cal HFA's low income down payment assistance program, and then also an additional $81 million. And that was really for the creation of a new program at Cal HFA, which is really interesting, which has been really focused on trying to provide more opportunities for lower income homeowners to build ADUs, and some of the financing barriers that we know folks face there. So just to mention those two things that I'm sure will continue to be a focus as we continue our budget conversations this session.
Thanks, Misa. Miles, what else is on people's minds?
One questioner was asking, at least with respect to land trusts, are land trusts something that is being considered in the San Diego region as another alternative here?
I could maybe talk to some of my involvement with land trusts. It sounds like this was specific to you, Seth, but you know, generally how that process works is a land trust would actually come to the planning department. They talk about a particular piece of property, and then you know how a bill like SB9 or density bonus law may help them, you know, with financing and things like that. And then a lot of times there's partnerships done with the cities for land owned that, you know, by the city, and you know the city would potentially do a lease of the land in exchange for their development of these affordable housing units. So that's you know, some of my knowledge on land trusts and how those things get built.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, Miles, except that you know, we're constantly looking for new ways to encourage affordable housing development, and if land trusts are part of the solution, it's certainly something we would consider.
Okay.
This one was a couple of questions about the issue of how is this all going to relate to homeowner associations in implementing, coming up against various homeowner regs.
Yeah, I can go ahead and answer that one, Mary. So SB9 doesn't override CID or HOA restrictions. There would have to be an explicit provision in the bill that said basically that SB9 would supersede HOA or CID's governing documents, which the bill does not contain. We saw that like with ADU law, for example, right, where there had to be very explicit language. That's not in SB9, so it doesn't override those restrictions if a particular HOA has them.
We also have a question. I think this is going to be for Seth regarding parking requirements outside and inside of transit priority areas. What is the distance requirement, and is it actually as the crow flies? And what about folks who live technically close enough to transportation that there does not need to be a parking requirement, yet far enough away that realistically they don't have much access?
That was something that we certainly heard in the hearing process. The definition that the city uses is from state law that says that it's an area, a half-mile area around high-quality transit. And so the area is a half-mile radius, so you could say as the crow flies. And one of the things that we're following up with, in addition to another SB10 and the other proposals that we'll be bringing forward later this year, is to take a look at some alternative definitions of a TPA. The thing that we need to be aware of, Miles, and why we didn't necessarily include this as part of SB9 is we have a number of programs like our Complete Communities program, like our residential parking requirements that use the definition of a TPA. And so we also need to, in addition to looking at some other definitions of what a TPA could be to address the concern that was raised in that question, is how does this affect our other programs in addition to SB9 and ADUs? So we'll be taking a look and doing some mapping and analysis work at alternative definitions of a TPA. So again, stay tuned for that, and it'll certainly be a part of our work effort going forward this year.
We've had some questions about the precise square footage on whether minimum or maximum. There was reference to maybe one of these local cities has defined, this is talking SB9 now, defined a minimum square footage. Several questions are, well, what are the maximums? What are the minimums in some of the cities that are represented here?
So I think part of this gets back to the idea that SB9 required, basically required the zone to allow, or required cities to allow for the development of an additional 800 square foot unit. And so we've got some language that says where the local floor area ratio, or FAR, would apply and still be consistent with that requirement. So if, let's say, in one of the scenarios like what Dave showed, if it's an addition of a second home and an existing home that's staying under SB9, we have to allow for the 800 square foot unit. If the existing home is being removed and additional units are being added, we still need to allow for an 8,800 square foot unit, but the city's FAR requirements for the existing zone would still apply. So it gets pretty complicated. Again, this is the challenge with implementing state law that is really kind of picking almost I don't want to call it a one-size-fits-all approach, but that is a fairly specific requirement that most zoning codes are not kind of equipped to handle without some interpretation. But I would, what we tried to do was allow for that 800 square foot unit addition, while also making sure that we were adhering to our local zones when it applies.
Yeah, I'll add to that. You know, I think the only thing that is in our draft right now with respect to minimums is really the minimum lot size if you're going to do a lot split. it has to be at least 1,200 square feet. So you're looking at an existing lot of 2,400 square feet, and some lots just don't meet that. And, you know, to the issue of, you know, we're going to look at setbacks. You know, there might be some, you know, geographical issues on the lot that just preclude the development of an additional unit. But as long as they meet those minimums of the lot, with respect, like I mentioned earlier, with respect to how large they want to develop that second unit, that's up to them. We're not going to say that it has to be 800 square feet. But you know, we'll look to our zoning regs for that area to kind of give guidance, and to obviously to SB9 with respect to what we can and cannot require of the homeowner.
There's a follow-up question on the owner occupancy requirement, and this person is saying that she understands the 3-year owner occupancy requirement, but what happens after that? Because developers often figure out workarounds or are willing to invest time in order to make a profit at some point down the road, as with the 2-year capital gains requirement, where a developer or owner lives in the house for 2 years to get the more attractive capital gains tax rate and then rents it out. How would you guys respond to that?
I can start. You know, I'm not sure if there's really a perfect answer, frankly, when it comes to the owner occupancy requirement, right? I think, I can't remember, Todd, if it was you who sort of referenced sort of some of the challenges in terms of enforcement, right? I think there's no law that we are going to be able to write where there aren't sort of ways that folks are going to find ways to get around them, right? But it's, you know, our hopes with, you know, kind of best practices in mind, that's 3 years was a long enough period to sort of discourage folks, but also really truthfully trying to keep in mind the real experience that families may be having, right? Like for me personally, I know I like doubled the size of my family, you know, and how quickly sort of we had kids back to back, right? So I think really just trying to sort of balance those two sort of factors and perspectives. But I think you're certainly right. There's no way I think we could have written it to sort of be a perfect solution where there weren't going to be sort of bad actors out there finding ways to get around it, truthfully.
A lot of concerns about neighborhood character, which might translate to historic preservation, or it's a big topic. I'd like to address some of our audience's concerns about how are various cities dealing with this. There's a bit of an education needed here. What is the process to qualify or not qualify as historic, as a way of preserving a neighborhood?
I'll just say for the city of San Diego, one of the things that we're looking at where SB9 applies and where it doesn't is within our existing historic districts, and also properties that are deemed historic. And so there's a hard exclusion on those sites. We do have a work program where we are trying to commit to developing additional historic districts. The process is somewhat complicated. I'm not going to get into all the details of it here, but it is something that we're constantly looking at as to ensure that we're, you know, striking a balance between all the development that we want to do and preserving historic communities where it's needed. I can probably pull up our website and put the link in the chat for folks who want to see more information about our historic preservation program.
We also have a historical preservation program that is in need of updating. It's rather old. It's a little bit cumbersome. We've struggled even internally as to, you know, we have a list of historical properties that have been designated, but we also have a list of properties that could be designated. And because that survey was done, does our program actually protect them or not? We've had some property owners that are on that list of potential historic sites come in and want to redevelop their properties. The city's kind of still struggling with that a little bit. But yeah, the same thing as Seth. We're looking for opportunities to expand that, if, where appropriate. It's one of my tasks over the next year or so that I want to try to tackle and get updated so that we have clear rules. And with respect to SB9, it's clear as to what is already designated, and we can definitely put that layer on when someone walks in and wants to potentially either do a lot split or redevelop the historical site. We can clearly say that that's not allowed, but there are those others that are kind of in that gray area that we still need to address.
We're in a similar boat as Todd and Chula Vista there. We're, I think we do have those sites that are, you could say locally designated, but not no state or national historical designation. My recommendation to the person inquiring is contact your local planner, give them, what you think those objective design standards are. I know I've had discussions with our planners about what is the look and feel that we want as it relates to these SB9 developments. Do you want side-by-side units versus the unit and the units in the back and the front and things like that? So, those types of questions are things that each local jurisdiction will grapple with. And if you have an opinion on it one way or the other about the look and feel of your neighborhood, email your local planner to kind of give them an idea of what you think would be best. And those objective design standards could potentially be implemented into a new ordinance.
Anyone else on that? We have a question for Todd and David. Seth already addressed it in his presentation. Do you guys have tree replacement regulations that relate to SB9?
We don't have anything specifically to SB9, no, at this time.
So the way Poway is looking at it with the handout is all of our current regulations are in place for all single family residential zones. So we have a landscape and irrigation design manual that must be adhered to. Now, if that manual is somehow precluding an SB9 development, then those are provisions we can enforce. But generally speaking, we do have tree and landscape requirements as a part of any new SB9 development.
And let me just add, I apologize. We also have a similar document as David's referring to, but we haven't tied it specifically to SB9 or referred to it in our draft ordinance. However, it is an underlying document that applies to the city and in certain zones, and there are regulations attached to them. So to that point, if the property is in one of those areas, then yes, they would still have to comply with that anyway, but it's not specifically tied to SB9.
Okay.
How about the question that the questioner asked was regarding water, and these new units that are coming in, how are they planned for? But maybe in specifics is also other utilities when maybe it's part of the process of when you're actually right down to the details, you're getting ready to build. How is the community assured that they're not going to usurp the capacity of the various infrastructures that they serve?
As it relates to water, we do an urban water management plan that gets updated every 5 years that anticipates a certain amount of growth and development. So the idea of having another process, and frankly, not knowing exactly what the number of SB9 units would be added, we would need to collect some data before we really know the impact on the water management plan. But we do have plans that show that we have enough water to meet the projected growth for the city of San Diego. into at least for the next 5 years. So I imagine when that plan gets updated, this would be the time to take a look at SB9 units that have been included and the ability for to ensure that we, if we need to make adjustments to that forecast, that we're doing so at that time.
Yeah, and we are in the process, like I said, internally, there are a lot of different divisions within the Development Service Department that are looking at this, and our land development team is looking at that specific issue. So we are in the process of analyzing it and hopefully updating our documents as well.
We did an analysis during our housing element adoption, which was adopted last August. So we have a 10-year forecast and no foreseeable issues in the future.
Mary, also just point to one more thing in the language. You know, local governments also retain the ability to deny a specific project, right? If they can document like a specific adverse impact to public health or safety. That was something that was added as the bill moved through the process. So I think it, you know, in addition to the conversations we've had about the ability, you know, to charge fees and have sort of the broader conversations that all the local folks are talking about, there is also that language in the bill.
We also have a question for Isa. In your opening comments, you mentioned the relationship between SB9 and the Coastal Act, and this person is saying, what did you mean when you said does not, quote, tangle with the Coastal Act? So can you clarify that relationship?
Sure. Yeah, I just meant to say that the bill doesn't supersede the Coastal Act, right? So similar to sort of the way that we talked about explicit language for HOAs and CIDs, right? Sort of the general process would continue, which you know, I know is going to vary throughout some of the localities, but just generally there's a provision in the bill that SB9 doesn't supersede the Coastal Act.
Okay.
I'm not sure how this relates, but there's concern among the questions about rental units, tenancy rights, and how does this legislation, how does it come into that question? There's a lot of concern about not everybody's a homeowner. How is this, you know, population of renters which are being faced with extraordinary rent increases? How does this help?
Mary, I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier on that's just important to include, because this was an important perspective, I think, while the bill is moving through the process. So one of sort of those hard exclusions, right, in addition to talking about you know, like historic districts, for example, is also a property where a tenant has lived in the last 3 years. And then there are some additional protections in the bill as it pertains to like the demo or alteration of homes that have tenants in it. So I think that's important to include. It was really important to make sure that tenants weren't being displaced, right, through the creation of new or the changing of any units through SB9. So that's an important perspective, I think, to share.
I think this question relates to that, and this questioner is asking, what was the purpose of SB9 if not affordable housing? And inherent in that, I think, is the belief that by encouraging more housing, even without a specific affordability requirement, that will, by increasing supply, that would ultimately lead to lower housing costs. But Misa, can you respond to that?
Sure, Miles. I don't know if I have much to add. I feel like you sort of just did kind of a great job of answering, right? I think one of the really key components to SB9 is just the additional options, right, that are presented. We know from some great studies looking at ADUs that they tend to be more naturally affordable, right? So if it's the creation of those units, great. But really, at the end of the day, we need more housing in California. I mentioned we've been underproducing housing for decades, right? That's certainly an important component. It's not the only component here, but providing opportunities for more types of housing in areas where folks live or maybe grew up or where they work. Those are all really important elements, I think, to this bill.
Here's a follow-up question regarding this intersection between the Coastal Act and actually SB10. The questioner is asking in specifics to this area, which is about some of the relocation of tracks in the sort of Del Mar Solana Beach area. That's going to potentially put mass transit into an area that might not have it. And how does that intersection of the Coastal Act and SB10 all come together in trying to get something done?
Mary, I'm not sure if I have the answer to that question. I would have to go back and look. Seth, I don't know if you know from looking probably more recently than I have at SB10, but first I would just say importantly, just to underscore that Solana Beach would have to elect to adopt to utilize SB10, right? So keep in mind, right, that's considerations that could be made locally, because SB10 doesn't just apply across the board, right? A locality has to pass an ordinance in order to utilize it.
Right. And I think from a very general sense, the interaction here will be when once we have an SB10 ordinance that we brought forward, it's anticipated that it would be making changes to our local coastal plan, which means that we would need to get coastal commission approval before it takes effect in the coastal zone. And so, we've done this with a number of housing programs that we brought forward. And sometimes we get concurrence from the coastal commission and things go smoothly. And sometimes they have other ideas and other approaches that they want to take to addressing some of the other issues that they're tasked with addressing as well. So it'll go through a similar process. SB10 will, I anticipate, because I'm sure some of these areas that we identify for SB10 will be within the coastal zone. And so we'll have to see how it goes when the time comes. But we don't have a proposal put forward yet, so I can't really speculate on the exact issues of that.
This question is for David. Given that Poway has much of your single-family sites are in high fire hazard areas, do you have any sense of how much single-family land is left for implementation of SB9?
Yeah, I think we have around 14,000 units total. 25% of the city isn't in the very high fire hazard areas, but those are, the more higher density single family residential zoning that has, between 4,000 square foot lot minimums and 10,000 square foot lot minimums. So, just guessing off the top of my head, I would say at least half of the single family residential lots would still qualify.
Okay.
Good question.
Miles, you see anything else there in this field of questions that is jumping out at you?
There's a question for Lisa. Do you have any data to justify your comment that ADUs are, quote, naturally occurring affordable housing, unquote?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have it included in our website or reference in any of the analyses that I share. One of them that we've looked at is one that's focused on the East Bay, another from SCAG for ADUs in Southern California. So those are a couple that we've been looking at and relying on. I think one of the East Bay, the finding was that the average ADU rental price is affordable to someone making 62% of the median income. And then the numbers were a little bit different, but pretty similar for some of the Southern California counties.
Okay. Mary, can I ask another question too?
Please do.
Okay. SB9 is really intended to promote additional units in single-family areas. How do you reconcile that with the objective of focusing future housing development in transit corridors?
I think our approach to this is to bring forward incentives and other ways to encourage growth in areas that have access to transit. And part of that is done through our long range planning efforts when we update community plans. That's always a big component, is to ensure that we have good housing capacity and maybe even our most intense housing capacity around areas with transit. SB9, pointing back to the idea of it being a tool in the toolbox, another way to encourage more housing development. 108,000 units in the city of San Diego is a very, very high bar. And so I think that it's going to take a number of different approaches. But we certainly approach our community plan update process and our housing incentives in a way that encourage the type of growth that can help meet our climate goals and our transportation goals.
Well,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Misa.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say thanks, Seth. I think we certainly don't see it as an either or conversation, right? I mentioned there were sort of a number of bills in that Senate housing package, a couple of which we didn't talk about. One was, an effort that I think we're going to continue to work on in the Senate, which was focusing on like commercial zones, for example, right? That's a really important element of this conversation we haven't talked about yet. And of course, I sort of referenced sort of the beginnings of the discussions of SB9 really centered after kind of falling on the heels of the failure of SB50 in the Senate. And you probably remember, Miles, that bill was really focused on the development near transit areas, right? So I think we certainly don't see it as an either or conversation. It's something I think we need to continue to address comprehensively here.
Well, Misa, you began our time together today talking that there's probably no silver bullet to address the housing crisis, but I firmly believe that having conversations like this and for all of us to gain a deeper understanding of how complex and interrelated state law, local implementation, the person on the ground trying to figure out what to do with their property, how complicated it is. And so on behalf of the League, we thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and ideas and to our panelists, and we thank the public for joining us today. We will all learn more and make better decisions as we go forward. So we thank you very much for your time and hope that you will respond to the survey that you'll get here shortly and follow up on any areas of interest that you have, either dropping a mail to us or any of our participants. So thank you very much. I hope you have a good day. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.